Alrighty, so let's continue with The Call of the Canyon. The Call of the Canyon by Zane Grey. We're up to Chapter 5. Chapter 5. We have, so far, it's all been Carly's point of view. I'm interested to learn more about Glenn Kilbourne and his experiences in the Great War. But man, coming back from that and then just wanting to retreat to the American West. There's I could understand that. Okay, let's do it. Chapter 5. Later, Carly leaned back in a comfortable seat before a blazing fire that happily sent its acrid smoke up the chimney, pondering ideas in her mind. There could be a relation to familiar things that was astounding in its revelation. To get off a horse that had tortured her, to discover an almost insatiable appetite, to rest weary, aching body before the genial warmth of a beautiful fire. These were experiences which Carly found to have been hitherto unknown delights. It struck her suddenly and strangely to know that the real truth about anything in life might require infinite experience and understanding. How could one feel immense gratitude and relief, or the delight of satisfying acute hunger, or the sweet comfort of rest, unless there had been circumstances of extreme contrast? She had been compelled to suffer cruelly on horseback in order to make her appreciate how good it was to get down on the ground. Otherwise, she would never have known. She wondered then how true that principle might be in all experience. It gave strong food for thought. There were things in the world never before dreamed of in her philosophy. Carly was wondering if she were narrow and dense to circumstances of life differing from her own, when a remark of Flo's gave pause to her reflections. "Sure the worst is yet to come," Flo had drawled. Carly wondered if this distressing statement had to do in some way with the rest of the trip. She stifled her curiosity. Painful knowledge of that sort would come quickly enough. "Flo, are you girls going to sleep here in the cabin?" inquired Glenn. "Sure. It's cold and wet outside," replied Flo. "Well, Felix, the Mexican herder, told me some Navajos had been bunking here."
"Navajos? You mean Indians?" interposed Carly with interest. "Sure do," said Flo. "I knew that. But don't mind Glenn. He's full of tricks, Carly. He'd give us a hunch to lie out in the wet."
Hunter burst into his hearty laugh. "Well, I'd rather get some things any day than a bad cold."
"Sure, I've had both," replied Flo in her easy drawl, "and I'd prefer the cold. But for Carly's sake—" "Pray don't consider me," said Carly. The rather crude drift of the conversation affronted her.
"Well, my dear," put in Glenn, "it's a bad night outside. We'll all make our beds here."
"Glenn, you sure are a nervy fellow," drawled Flo.
Long after everybody was in bed, Carly lay awake in the blackness of the cabin, sensitively fidgeting and quivering over imaginative contact with creeping things. The fire had died out. A cold air passed through the room. On the roof pattered gusts of rain. Carly heard a rustling of mice. It did not seem possible that she could keep awake, yet she strove to do so. But her pangs of body, her extreme fatigue, soon yielded to the quiet and rest of her bed, engendering a drowsiness that proved irresistible. Morning brought fair weather and sunshine, which helped sustain Carly in her effort to brave out her pains and woes. Another disagreeable day would have forced her to humiliating defeat. Fortunately for her, the business of the men was concerned with the immediate neighborhood, in which they expected to stay all morning. "Flo, after a while, persuade Carly to ride with you to the top of this first foothill," said Glenn. "It's not far, and it's worth a good deal to see the painted desert from there. The day is clear and the air free from dust."
"Sure, leave it to me. I want to get out of camp anyhow. That conceited hombre, Lee Stanton, will be riding in here,"
answered Flo laconically. The slight knowing smile on Glenn's face and the grinning disbelief on Mr. Hutter's were facts not lost upon Carly. And when Charlie, the herder, deliberately winked at Carly, she conceived the idea that Flo, like many women, only ran off to be pursued. In some manner, Carly did not seek to analyze the purported advent. In some manner, Carly did not seek to analyze the purported advent of this Lee Stanton pleased her. But she did admit to her consciousness that women, herself included, were both as deep and mysterious as the sea, yet as transparent as an inch of crystal water. It happened that the expected newcomer rode into camp before anyone left. Before he dismounted, he made a good impression on Carly, and as he stepped down in lazy, graceful action, a tall, lithe figure, she thought him singularly handsome. He wore black sombrero, flannel shirt, blue jeans stuffed into high boots, and long, big roweled spurs. "How are y'all?" was his greeting. From the talk that ensued between him and the men, Carly concluded that he must be overseer of the sheep hands. Carly knew that Hutter and Glenn were not interested in cattle raising, and in fact they were, especially Hutter, somewhat inimical to the dominance of the rangeland by cattle barons of Flagstaff. "When's Ryan going to dip?" asked Hutter. "Today or tomorrow," replied Stanton. "Reckon we ought to ride on over?" went on Hutter. "Say, Glenn, do you reckon Miss Carly could stand a sheep dip?" This was spoken in a low tone, scarcely intended for Carly, but she had keen ears and heard distinctly. And not improbably this sheep dip was what Flo meant as the worst to come. Carly adopted a listless posture to hide her keen desire to hear what Glenn would reply to Hutter. "Oh, I should say not," whispered Glenn fiercely. "Cut out that talk. She'll hear you and want to go." Whereupon Carly felt mount in her breast an intense and rebellious determination to see a sheep dip. She would astonish Glenn. What did he want, anyway? Had she not withstood the torturing trot of the hardest gated horses? Had she not withstood the torturing trot of the hardest gated horse on the range? Carly realized she was going to place considerable store upon that feat. It grew on her. When the consultation of the men ended, Lee Stanton turned to Flo, and Carly did not need to see the young man look twice to divine what ailed him. He was caught in the toils of love. But seeing through Flo, Hutter was entirely another matter.
"Howdy, Lee,"
she said coolly, with her clear eyes on him. A tiny frown knitted her brow. She did not, at the moment, entirely approve of him.
"Sure am glad to see you, Flo,"
he said, with a rather heavy expulsion of breath. He wore a cheerful grin that in no wise deceived Flo, or Carly either. The young man had a furtive expression of eye.
"Uh-huh," returned
Flo.
"I was sure sorry about that,
he floundered in low voice.
"About what?"
"Ah, you know, Flo." Carly strolled out of hearing, sure of two things: that she felt rather sorry for Stanton, and that his course of love did not augur well for smooth running. What queer creatures were women? Carly had seen several million coquettes, she believed, and assuredly Flo Hutter belonged to the species. Upon Carly's return to the cabin, she found Stanton and Flo waiting for her to accompany them on a ride up the foothill. She was so stiff and sore that she could hardly mount into the saddle, and the first mile of riding was something like a nightmare. She lagged behind Flo and Stanton, who had apparently forgot her in their quarrel. The riders soon struck the base of a long incline of rocky ground that led up to the slope of the foothill. Here rocks and gravel gave place to black cinders, out of which grew a scant bleached grass. This desert verdure was what lent the soft gray shade to the foothill when seen from a distance. The slope was gentle, so that the ascent did not entail any hardship. Carly was amazed at the length of the slope, and also to see how high over the desert she was getting. She felt lifted out of a monotonous level. A green-gray, league-long cedar forest extended down toward Oak Creek. Behind her, the magnificent bulk of the mountains reached up into the stormy clouds, showing white slopes of snow under the gray pall. The hoofs of the horses sank in the cinders. A fine choking dust assailed Carly's nostrils. Presently, when there appeared at least a third of the ascent still to be accomplished, and Flo dismounted... wow, some of these paragraphs. Presently, when there appeared at least a third of the ascent still to be accomplished, and Flo dismounted to walk, leading their horses, that should be a comma in there, not a full stop. Carly had no choice but to do likewise. Okay, so that was just bad, not correctly written. Okay. At first, walking was a relief. Soon, however, the soft, yielding cinders began to drag at her feet. At every step she slipped back a few inches, a very annoying feature of climbing. When her legs seemed to grow dead, Carly paused for a little rest. The last of the ascent, over a few hundred yards of looser cinders, taxed her remaining strength to the limit. She grew hot and wet and out of breath. Her heart labored. An unreasonable antipathy seemed to attend her efforts. Only her ridiculous vanity held her to this task. She wanted to please Glenn, but not so earnestly that she would have kept on plodding up this ghastly, bare mound of cinders. Carly did not mind being a tenderfoot, but she hated the thought of these Westerners considering her a weakling. So she bore the pain of raw blisters and the miserable sensation of staggering on under a leaden weight. Several times she noted that Flo and Stanton halted to face each other in rather heated argument. At least Stanton's red face and forceful gestures attested to heat on his part. Flo evidently was wary of argument, and in answer to a sharp reproach, she retorted, "Sure, I was different after he came," to which Stanton responded by a quick, passionate shrinking, as if he had been stung. Carly had her own reaction to this speech she could not help hearing, and inwardly, at least, her feeling must have been similar to Stanton's. She forgot the object of this climb and looked off to her right, at the green level, without really seeing it. A vague sadness weighed upon her soul. Was there to be a tangle of fates here, a conflict of wills, a crossing of loves? Flo's terse confession could not be taken lightly. Did she mean that she loved Glenn? Carly began to fear it. Only another reason why she must persuade Glenn to go back east. But the closer Carly came to what she divined must be an ordeal, the more she dreaded it. This raw, crude West might have confronted her with a situation beyond her control, and as she dragged her weighted feet through the cinders, kicking up little puffs of black dust, she felt what she admitted to be an unreasonable resentment toward these Westerners and their barren, isolated, and boundless world. "Carly," called Flo, "come. Look, see, as the Indians say. Here's Glenn's painted desert, and I reckon it's sure worth seeing." To Carly's surprise, she found herself upon the knob of the foothill, and when she looked out across a suddenly distinguishable void, she seemed struck by the immensity of something she was unable to grasp. She dropped her bridle. She gazed slowly, as if drawn, hearing Flo's voice. "That thin green line of cottonwoods down there is the Little Colorado River," Flo was saying. "Reckon it's 60 miles, all downhill. The Painted Desert begins there, and also the Navajo Reservation. You see the white strips, the red veins, the yellow bars, the black lines? They are all desert steps leading up and up for miles. That sharp black peak is called Wildcat. It's about 100 miles. You see the desert stretching away to the right, growing dim, lost in distance. We don't know that country, but that north country we know as landmarks anyway. Look at that Sawtooth Range. The Indians call it Echo Cliffs. At the far end it drops off into the Colorado River. Lee's Ferry is there, about 160 miles. That ragged black rent is the Grand Canyon. Looks like a thread, doesn't it? But, Carly, it's some hole, believe me. Away to the left you can see that tremendous wall rising and turning to come this way. That's the north wall of the canyon. It ends at the great bluff, Greenland Point. See the black fringe above the bar of gold? That's a belt of pines. It's about 80 miles across, this ragged old stone washboard of a desert. Now turn and look straight, and strain your sight over Wildcat. See the rim purple dome? You must look hard. I'm glad it's clear and the sun is shining. We don't often get this view. That purple dome is Navajo Mountain, 200 miles and more away." Carly yielded to some strange drawing power and slowly walked forward until she stood at the extreme edge of the summit. What was it that confounded her sight? Desert slope, down and down, color, distance, space. The wind that blew in her face seemed to have the openness of the whole world back of it. Cold, sweet, dry, exhilarating, it breathed of untainted vastness. Carly's memory pictures of the Adirondacks faded into pastorals. Her vaunted images of European scenery changed to operetta settings. She had nothing with which to compare this illimitable space. "Oh, America," was her unconscious tribute. Stanton and Flo had come on to places beside her. The young man laughed. "Well, now, Miss Carly, you couldn't say more. When I was in camp training for service overseas, I used to remember how this looked, and it seemed one of those things I was going to fight for. Reckon I didn't get the idea of the Germans having my Painted Desert. I didn't get across to fight for it, but I sure was willing." "You see, Carly, this is our America," said Flo softly. Carly had never understood the meaning of the word. The immensity of the West seemed flung at her. What her vision beheld, so far-reaching and boundless, was only a dot on the map. "Does anyone live out there?" she asked, with a slow sweep of hand. "A few white traders and some Indian tribes," replied Stanton. "But you can ride all day, and next day, and never see a living soul." What was the meaning of the gratification in his voice? Did Westerners court loneliness? Carly wrenched her gaze from the desert void to look at her companions. Stanton's eyes were narrowed. His expression had changed. Lean and hard and still, his face resembled bronze. The careless humor was gone, as was the heated flush of his quarrel with Flo. The girl, too, had subtly changed, had responded to an influence that had subdued and softened her. She was mute. Her eyes held a light, comprehensive and all-embracing. She was beautiful then. For Carly, quick to read emotion, caught a glimpse of a strong, steadfast soul that spiritualized the brown, freckled face. Carly wheeled to gaze out and down into this incomparable abyss and onto the far, upflung heights, white and red and yellow, and so on to the wonderful, mystic haze of distance. The significance of Flo's designation of miles could not be grasped by Carly. She could not estimate distance, but she did not need that to realize her perceptions were swallowed up by magnitude. Hitherto the power of her eyes had been unknown. How splendid to see afar! She could see, yes, but what did she see? Space first, annihilating space, dwarfing her preconceived images, and then wondrous colors. What had she known of color? No wonder artists failed adequately and truly to paint mountains, let alone the desert space. The toiling millions of the crowded cities were ignorant of this terrible beauty and sublimity. Would it have helped them to see? But just to breathe that untainted air, just to see once the boundless open of colored sand and rock, to realize what the freedom of eagles meant, would that not have helped anyone? And with the thought there came to Carly's quickened and struggling mind a conception of freedom. She had not yet watched eagles, but she now gazed out into their domain. What then must be the effect of such environment on people whom it encompassed? The idea stunned Carly. Would such people grow in proportion to the nature with which they were in conflict? Hereditary influence could not be comparable to such environment in the shaping of character. "Sure, I could stand here all day," said Flo. "But it's beginning to cloud over, and this high wind is cold. So we'd better go, Carly." "I don't know what I am, but it's not cold," replied Carly. "Well, Miss Carly, I reckon you'll come again and again before you get a comfortable feeling here." Oh, that's Stanton. Ah, boy. Okay. Designating the speaker at the end of a sentence, right. "Well, Miss Carly, I reckon you'll have to come again and again before you'll get a comfortable feeling here," said Stanton. It surprised Carly to see this young man Westerner had hit upon the truth. He understood her. Indeed, she was uncomfortable. She was oppressed, vaguely unhappy. But why? The thing there, the infinitude of open sand and rock, was beautiful, wondrous, even glorious. She looked again. Steep, black-cindered slope, with its soft gray patches of grass, sheered down and out in rolling slope to merge upon a cedar-dotted level. Nothing moved. Nothing moved below, but a red-tailed hawk sailed across her vision. How still, how gray the desert floor as it reached away, losing its black dots and gaining bronze spots of stone. By plain and prairie it fell away, each gray inch in her sight magnifying into its league-long roll. On and down across dark lines that were steps, and at last blocked and changed by the meandering green thread which was the verdure of a desert river. Beyond stretched the white sand, where whirlwinds of dust sent aloft their funnel-shaped spouts, and it led up to the horizon-wide ribs and ridges of red and wall. Oh boy. Let's back up a little. Beyond stretched the white sand, where whirlwinds of dust sent aloft their funnel-shaped spouts, and it led up to the horizon-wide ribs and ridges of red and walls of yellow and mountains of black to the dim mound of purple, so ethereal and mystic against the deep blue, cloud-curtained band of sky. And on the moment the sun was obscured, and that world of colourful flame went out, as if a blaze had died. Deprived of its fire, the desert seemed to retreat, to fade coldly and gloomily, to lose its great landmarks in dim obscurity. Closer, around to the north, the canyon country yawned with innumerable grey jaws, ragged and hard, and the riven earth took on a different character. It had no shadows. It grew flat, and, like the sea, seemed to mirror the vast grey cloud expanse. The sublime vanished, but the desolate remained. No warmth, no movement, no life. Dead stone it was, cut into a million ruts by ruthless ages. Carly felt that she was gazing down into chaos. At this moment, as before, a hawk had crossed her vision. So now a raven sailed by, black as coal, uttering a hoarse croak. "Quoth the raven," murmured Carly, with a half-bitter laugh, as she turned away, shuddering in spite of an effort of self-control. "Maybe he meant this wonderful and terrible West is never for such as I. Come, let's go." Carly rode all that afternoon in the rear of the caravan, gradually succumbing to the cold, raw wind and the aches and pains to which she had subjected her flesh. Nevertheless, she finished the day's journey, and sorely as she needed Glenn's kindly hand, she got off her horse without aid. Camp was made at the edge of the devastated timber zone that Carly had found so dispiriting. A few melancholy pines were standing, and everywhere, as far as she could see southward, were blackened, fallen trees and stumps. It was a dreary scene. The few cattle grazing on the bleached grass appeared as melancholy as the pines. The sun shone fitfully at sunset and then sank, leaving the land to twilight and shadows. Once in a comfortable seat beside the campfire, Carly had no desire to move. She was so far exhausted and weary that she could no longer appreciate the blessing of rest. Appetite, too, failed her this mealtime. Darkness soon settled down. The wind moaned through the pines. She was indeed glad to crawl into bed, and not even the thought of skunks could keep her awake. Morning disclosed the fact that grey clouds had been blown away. The sun shone bright upon a white frosted land. The air was still. Carly labored at her task of rising and brushing her hair and pulling on her boots, and it appeared her former sufferings were as naught compared with the pangs of this morning. How she hated the cold, the bleak, denuded forest land, the emptiness, the roughness, the crudeness. If this sort of feeling grew any worse, she thought she would hate Glenn. Yet she was none the less set upon going on and seeing the sheep dip and riding that fiendish mustang until the trip was ended. Getting in the saddle and on the way this morning was an ordeal that made Carly actually sick. Glenn and Flo both saw how it was with her, and they left her to herself. Carly was grateful for this understanding. It seemed to proclaim their respect. She found further matter for satisfaction in the astonishing circumstance that, after the first dreadful quarter of an hour in the saddle, she began to feel easier. And at the end of several hours of riding, she was not suffering any particular pain, though she was weaker. At length the cut-over land ended in a forest of straggling pines through which the road wound southward, and eventually down into a wide, shallow canyon. Through the trees, Carly saw a stream of water, open fields of green, log fences and cabins, and blue smoke. She heard the chug of a gasoline engine and the baa-baa of sheep. Glenn waited for her to catch up with him, and he said, Carly, this is one of Hutter's sheep camps. It's not a very pleasant place. You won't care to see the sheep dip, so I'm suggesting you wait here."
"Nothing doing, Glenn," she interrupted. "I'm going to see what there is to see."
"But, dear, the men, the way they handle sheep, they'll, really, it's no sight for you," he floundered.
"Why not?"
she inquired, eyeing him. "Because, Carly, you know how much you hate the seamy side of things, and the stench. Why, it'll make you sick."
"Glenn, be on the level," she said. "Suppose it does. Wouldn't you think more of me if I could stand it?"
"Why, yes," he replied reluctantly, smiling at her. "I would, but I wanted to spare you. This trip has been hard. I'm sure proud of you, and, Carly, you can overdo it. Spunk is not everything. You simply couldn't stand this."
"Glenn, how little you know a woman!" she exclaimed. "Come along and show me your old sheep-dip."
They rode out of the woods into an open valley that might have been picturesque if it had not been despoiled by the work of man. A log fence ran along the edge of open ground, and a muddy dam held back a pool of stagnant water, slimy and green. As Carly rode on, the baa-baa of sheep became so loud that she could scarcely hear Glenn talking. Several log cabins, rough-hewn and gray with age, stood down inside the enclosure, and beyond there were large corrals. From the other side of these corrals came sounds of rough voices of men, a trampling of hoofs, heavy splashes, the beat of an engine, and the incessant baaing of the sheep. At this point, the members of Hutter's party dismounted and tied their horses to the top log of the fence. When Carly essayed to get off, Glenn tried to stop her, saying she could well enough see from there. But Carly got down and followed Flo. She heard Hutter call to Glenn, "Say, Ryan is short of men. We'll lend a hand for a couple of hours." Presently Carly reached Flo's side and the first corral that contained sheep. They formed a compact woolly mass, rather white in color, with a tinge of pink. When Flo climbed up on the fence, the flock plunged as one animal, and with a trampling roar ran to the far side of the corral. Several old rams with wide curling horns faced around, and some of the ewes climbed up on the densely packed mass. Carly rather enjoyed watching them. She surely could not see anything amiss in this sight. The next corral held a like number of sheep, and also several Mexicans who were evidently driving them into a narrow lane that led farther down. Carly saw the heads of men above other corral fences, and there was also a thick yellowish smoke rising from somewhere.
"Carly, are you game to see the dip?"
asked Flo with good nature that yet had a touch of taunt in it.
"Oh, that's my middle name," retorted Carly flippantly.
Both Glenn and this girl seemed to be bent upon bringing out Carly's worst side, and they were succeeding. Flo laughed. The ready slang pleased her. She led Carly along that log fence, through a huge open gate, and across a wide pen to another fence, which she scaled. Carly followed her, not particularly over-anxious to look ahead. Some thick odor had begun to reach Carly's delicate nostrils. Flo led down a short lane and climbed another fence and sat astride the top log. Carly hurried along to clamber up to her side, but stood erect with her feet on the second log of the fence. Then a horrible stench struck Carly, almost like a blow in the face, and before her confused sight there appeared to be drifting smoke and active men and running sheep, all against a background of mud. But at first it was the odor that caused Carly to close her eyes and press her knees hard against the upper log to keep from reeling. Never in her life had such a sickening nausea assailed her. It appeared to attack her whole body. The forerunning qualm of seasickness was as nothing to this. Carly gave a gasp, pinched her nose between her fingers so she could not smell, and opened her eyes. Directly beneath her was a small pen, open at one end, into which sheep were being driven from the larger corral. The drivers were yelling. The sheep in the rear plunged into those ahead of them, forcing them on. 2 men worked in this small pen. One was a brawny giant, in undershirt and overalls that appeared filthy. He held the cloth in his hand and strode toward the nearest sheep. Folding the cloth round the neck of the sheep, he dragged it forward with an ease which showed great strength, and threw it into a pit that yawned at the side. Souse went the sheep into a murky, muddy pool and disappeared. But suddenly its head came up, and then its shoulders, and it began half to walk and half swim down what appeared to be a narrow, box-like ditch that contained other floundering sheep. Then Carly saw men on each side of this ditch bending over with poles that had crooks at the end, and their work was to press and pull the sheep along the end of the ditch and drive them up a boarded incline into another corral where many other sheep huddled, now a dirty, muddy color like the liquid into which they had been immersed. Souse, splash. In went sheep after sheep. Occasionally one did not go under, and then a man would press it under with the crook and quickly lift its head. The work went on with precision and speed, in spite of the yells and trampling and baa-baas and the incessant action that gave an effect of confusion. Carly saw a pipe leading from a huge boiler to the ditch. The dark fluid was running out of it. From a rusty engine with big smokestack poured the strangling smoke. A man broke open a sack of yellow powder and dumped it into the ditch. Then he poured an acid-like liquid after it. "Sulphur and nicotine," yelled Flo up at Carly. "The dip's poison. If a sheep opens his mouth, he's usually a goner, but sometimes they save one." Carly wanted to tear herself away from this disgusting spectacle, but it held her by some fascination. She saw Glenn and Hutter fall in line with the other men and work like beavers. These 2 pacemakers in the small pen kept the sheep coming so fast that every worker below had a task cut out for him. Suddenly Flo squealed and pointed. "There, that sheep didn't come up," she cried. "Sure, he opened his mouth." Then Carly saw Glenn energetically plunge his hooked pole in and out and around until he had located the submerged sheep. He lifted its head above the dip. The sheep showed no signs of life. Down on his knees dropped Glenn to reach the sheep with strong brown hands and to haul it up on the ground where it flopped inert. Glenn pummeled it and pressed it and worked on it, much as Carly had seen a lifeguard work over a half-drowned man. But the sheep did not respond to Glenn's active administrations. "No use, Glenn," yelled Hutter hoarsely. "That one's a goner." Carly did not fail to note the state of Glenn's hands and arms and overalls when he returned to the ditch work. Then back and forth Carly's gaze went from one end to the other of that scene, and suddenly it was arrested and held by the huge fellow who had handled the sheep so brutally. Every time he dragged one and threw it into the pit, he yelled, "Ho! Ho!" Carly was impelled to look at his face, and she was amazed to meet the rawest and boldest stare from evil eyes that ever had been her misfortune to incite. She felt herself stiffen with a shock that was unfamiliar. This man was scarcely many years older than Glenn, yet he had grizzled hair, a seamed and scarred visage, coarse, thick lips, and beetling brows, from under which peered gleaming light eyes. At every turn he flashed them upon Carly's face, her neck, the swell of her bosom. It was instinct that caused her hastily to close her riding coat. She felt as if her flesh had been burned. Like a snake, he fascinated her. The intelligence in his bold gaze made the beastliness of it all the harder to endure, all the stronger to arouse.
"Come, Carly, let's rustle out of this stinking mess," cried Flo.
Indeed, Carly needed Flo's assistance in clambering down out of the choking smoke and horrid odor. "Adios, pretty eyes," called the man from the pen.
"Well,"
exclaimed Flo when they got out,
"I bet I called Glenn good and hard for letting you go down there." It was my fault," panted Carly. "I said I'd stand it." "Oh, your game all right. I didn't mean the dip. That sheep-slinger is Hayes Ruff, the toughest hombre on this range. Sure now, wouldn't I like to take a shot at him? I'm going to tell Dad and Glenn." "Oh, please don't," returned Carly appealingly. "I sure am. Dad needs hands these days. That's why he's lenient. But Glenn will cowhide Ruff, and I want to see him do it."
In Flo Hutter, then, Carly saw another and a different spirit of the West, a violence unrestrained and fierce that showed in the girl's even voice and in the piercing light of her eyes. I always stop here just for a second to catch up on chat. So I've been missing a bit, trying to work on that. Boy, oh boy, a little sip of water too while I'm at it. Okay, so Melissa says green hearts. Fair enough. I like it. William, woohoo, ham radio saves the day again. You got to be the head of the hurricane readiness group this morning, relaying messages from people who lost power. Nice. Oh, okay, that's very cool. Very cool. And the chat message pop up. Yeah, it finally started. I mean, it's been there for a bit, but I don't know. Yeah, it just kicked in today. I don't know why. So there, BW, good to see you, man. Oh, you guys are going to be losing power where you are, William and Melissa? That's not good. They're waiting to shut the power down. Let's see. Whoa, let's turn that down. That's not supposed to be doing that. Yeah, this phone is playing up a little. But once every couple of days, it'll just like it's like the SIM card's not seated properly. Melissa's stuck in town. Oh, the road to your home is shut down. Oh boy, that's no good. That's no good. My webcam's all blurry. Oh, yeah, it is. Yeah, okay, so I guess the autofocus went out. All right. Who knows what's happening? I don't know. Okay, okay, Melissa's down your mom's house. Okay, all right. Very good, very good. Okay. All right. Okay. I think I'm all caught up with chat. Yeah. So I'm adding things to the stream to bring it up. It's not going to be as garish as my Twitch stream, but there are going to be a couple of other more interactive things popping up on the right side. But yeah. Okay. Let us let's continue. There we go. They went back to the horses, got their lunches from the saddlebags, and finding comfortable seats in a sunny, protected place, they ate and talked. Carly had to force herself to swallow. It seemed that the horrid odor of dip and sheep had permeated everything. Glenn had known her better than she had known herself, and he had wished to spare her an unnecessary and disgusting experience. Yet so stubborn was Carly that she did not regret going through with it.
"Carly, I don't mind telling you that you've stuck it out better than any tenderfoot we ever had here," said Flo. "Thank you. That from a Western girl is a compliment I'll not soon forget," replied Carly. "I sure mean it. We've had rotten weather, and to end this little trip at this sheep dip hole, why, Glenn certainly wanted you to stack up against the real thing." Flo, he did not want me to come on the trip, and especially here, protested Carly. Sure, I know, but he let you. Well, neither Glenn nor any other man could prevent me from doing what I wanted to do. Well, if you'll excuse me, drawled Flo, I'll differ with you. I reckon Glenn Kilbourne is not the man you knew before the war. No, he's not, but that does not alter the case. Carly, we're not well acquainted, went on Flo, more carefully feeling her way, and I'm not your kind. I don't know your Eastern ways, but I know what the West does to a man. The war ruined your friend, both his body and mind. How sorry Mother and I were for Glenn those days when he looked he'd sure go west for good. Did you know he'd been gassed, and that he'd had 5 hemorrhages? Oh, I knew his lungs had been weakened by gas, but he never told me about having hemorrhages. Well, he sure had them. The last one I'll never forget. Every time he'd cough, it would fetch the blood. I could tell. It was awful. I begged him not to cough. He smiled, like a ghost smiling, and he whispered, I'll quit. And he did. The doctor came from Flagstaff and packed him in ice. Glenn sat propped up all night and never moved a muscle, never coughed again, and the bleeding stopped. After that, we put him out on the porch where he could breathe fresh air all the time. There's something wonderfully healing in Arizona air. It's from the dry desert, and here it's full of cedar and pine. Anyway, Glenn got well, and I think the West has cured his mind, too. Of what? Queried Carly, in an intense curiosity she could scarcely hide. Oh, God only knows, exclaimed Flo, throwing up her gloved hands. I never could understand, but I hated what the war did to him. Carly leaned back against the log, quite spent. Flo was unwittingly torturing her. Carly wanted passionately to give in to jealousy of this Western girl, but she could not do it. Flo Hutter deserved better than that, and Carly's baser nature seemed in conflict with all that was noble in her. The victory did not yet go to either side. This was a bad hour for Carly. Her strength had about played out, and her spirit was at low ebb. Carly, you're all in, declared Flo. You needn't deny it. I'm sure you've made good with me as a tenderfoot who stayed the limit, but there's no sense in your killing yourself, nor in me letting you. So I'm going to tell Dad we want to go home. She left Carly there. We got more chat and chats. All right. It was Rose is oh my gosh about what? That was about when they were talking about the being gassed and the lung damage. Anya likes no notifications too. Well, we're going to have something, but there won't be any audio. There won't be any audio to go with it. But I really like my garish sounds. But yeah, it's definitely a little muddled over on Twitch right now. Yeah, poor Glenn. Yeah, war. Oh boy, it ain't good for anyone. Ain't good for anyone. She left Carly there. The word home had struck strangely into Carly's mind and remained there. Suddenly she realized what it was to be homesick. The comfort, the ease, the luxury, the rest, the sweetness, the pleasure, the cleanliness, the gratification to eye and ear, to all the senses, how these thoughts came to haunt her. All of Carly's willpower had been needed to sustain her on this trip, to keep her from miserably failing. She had not failed, but contact with the West had affronted, disgusted, shocked, and alienated her. In that moment she knew she could not be fair-minded. She knew it and did not care. Carly gazed around her. Only one of the cabins was in sight from this position.
Evidently, it was a home for some of these men. On one side, the peaked rough roof had been built out beyond the wall, evidently to serve as a kind of porch. On that wall hung the motliest assortment of things Carly had ever seen: utensils, sheep and cowhides, saddles, harness, leather clothes, ropes, old sombreros, shovels, stovepipe, and many other articles for which she could find no name. The most striking characteristic manifest in this collection was that of service. How they had been used. They had enabled people to live under primitive conditions. Somehow this fact inhibited Carly's sense of repulsion at their rude and uncouth appearance. Had any of her forefathers ever been pioneers? Carly did not know, but the thought was disturbing. It was thought-provoking. Many times at home, when she was dressing for dinner, she had gazed into the mirror, at the graceful lines of her throat and arms, at the proud poise of her head, at the alabaster whiteness of her skin, and wonderingly she had asked of her image, "Can it be possible that I am a descendant of cavemen?" She had never been able to realize it, yet she knew it was true. Perhaps somewhere not far back along her line there had been a great-great-grandmother who had lived some kind of a primitive life, using such implements and necessaries as hung on this cabin wall, and thereby helped some man to conquer the wilderness, to live in it and reproduce his kind. Like flashes, Glenn's words came back to Carly: work and children. Some interpretation of his meaning and how it related to this hour held aloof from Carly. If she would ever be big enough to understand it and broad enough to accept it, the time was far distant. Just now she was sore and sick physically, and therefore certainly not in a receptive state of mind. Yet how could she have keener impressions than these she was receiving? It was all a problem. She grew tired of thinking. But even then her mind pondered on, a stream of consciousness over which she had no control. This dreary woods was deserted. No birds, no squirrels, no creatures such as fancy anticipated. In another direction, across the canyon, she saw cattle, gaunt, ragged, lumbering, and stolid. And on the moment the scent of sheep came on the breeze. Time seemed to stand still here, and what Carly wanted most was for the hours and days to fly, so that she would be home again. At last Flo returned with the men. One quick glance at Glenn convinced Carly that Flo had not yet told them about the sheep-dipper, Hayes Ruff. "Carly, you're a real sport," declared Glenn, with the rare smile she loved. "It's a dreadful mess, and to think you stood it. Why, old Fifth Avenue, if you needed to make another hit with me, you've done it." His warmth amazed and pleased Carly. She could not quite understand why it would have made any difference to him whether she had stood the ordeal or not. But then, every day she seemed to drift a little farther from a real understanding of her lover. His praise gladdened her and fortified her to face the rest of this ride back to Oak Creek. Yeah, I've never, just thinking aside here, I mean, I've been to like a lot of sheep dips, and I don't recall it being as nasty as this. I'm pretty sure they weren't using big mixtures of sulfur and nicotine. I don't know. But no, like it was, it was not really a big deal. You had to do the sheep dip. So, yeah, it was I don't know. Don't know. Oh, Anya misses the stream avatars. Yeah, I mean, I could load that up on this machine, but I think it might make it. It probably would make it too cluttered. Probably would. Wow, you two must be pretty much in the sticks there. When a power line goes down and they're like, oh, it'll be the rest of the day to get fixed. Good gracious. Couldn't get away from them. From what? You couldn't get away from the sheep where I come from. They're everywhere. Everywhere. Okay. Let's continue here. 4 hours later, in a twilight so shadowy that no one saw her distress, Carly half slipped and half fell from her horse and managed somehow to mount the steps and enter the bright living room. A cheerful red fire blazed on the hearth. Glenn's hound, Mose, trembled eagerly at sight of her and looked up with humble dark eyes. The white-clothed dinner table steamed with savory dishes. Flo stood before the blaze, warming her hands. Lee Stanton leaned against the mantel, with eyes on her, and every line of his lean, hard face expressed his devotion to her. Hutter was taking his seat at the head of the table. "Come and get it, y'all," he called heartily. Mrs. Hutter's face beamed with the spirit of that home. And lastly, Carly saw Glenn waiting for her, watching her come, true in this very moment to his stern hope for her and pride in her, as she dragged her weary, spent body toward him and the bright fire. By these signs, or the effect of them, Carly vaguely realized that she was incalculably changing, that this Carly Birch had become a vastly bigger person in the sight of her friends, and strangely, in her own, a lesser creature. Why, into chapter 5. All about the sheeps. All about the sheeps. Oh, wow. You have 100-mile-an-hour winds. 100 to 150 mile an hour winds this morning. Wow, that's a lot. 1.4 million people without power in the state. Okay, I guess it will take a little. To get all those power lines back up. It's going to be a lot to fix. 100 to. I mean, is that normal? That doesn't sound normal. You're not in like Tornado Alley. I don't think. Man, boy, oh boy, that is some remarkable wind you got going there. Alrighty. Okay, so that chapter was a bit longer than the other ones, I believe. Took us almost an hour to get through that one. That is a lot. Alrighty. Let's see. So we're in between chapters right now. We'll get on with chapter 6 there in just a minute. I just wanted to say hello to anyone who might be new in the channel there. Says we got 10 people watching us live. That's wow. Okay, we're growing slowly but surely. But yeah, if you're new to the channel, and if you like tuning in for a live audiobook narration, Monday through Thursday is when we do it. Start at about 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. Go for roughly 2 hours, sometimes a little longer. Yeah. But anyway, say hi. Throw a like down on the stream. Throw a follow to my YouTube channel. Yeah. Little by little, we're going to get there. Hurricane Zeta. Well, they're at Z already for hurricanes this year. Because then it goes into the back to the A's, right? They still do it alphabetically, I'm pretty sure. Man, from the Gulf, wow. Weather's crazy. The weather is crazy. Oh, did I lose my mouse? Oh, there it is. Yeah. Okay, yeah, my wireless mouse there. If I don't use it for like 3 or 4 minutes, it turns off. Okay, let's get on with our. Melissa says 2020 is crazy. Man, can't wait for 2020 to be out of here. Anya says we're learning about sheep dip, which is nothing like it's nothing at all like artichoke dip, but it needs to be done, and because the sheep, that they might get ticks and lice or fleas or all kinds of stuff in their fur, in their wool. So you just like force all the sheep into the sheep dip, which is like it kills all of that stuff there. And but yeah. It was a very common thing, back where I was growing up, and yeah. I mean, you got to look after your sheepies. All right, let's get on with our story. Here we go. No, my mouse. Good. Okay, there we go. Chapter 6. If spring came at all to Oak Creek Canyon, it warmed into summer. Oh, actually, you know what? Before we get back into Chapter 6, I just need to make a quick change to that chat box. Going to change the amount of time that it stays for. Hide message after... There we go, after 2 minutes. All right. Okay, so right now it's set to vanish after 60 seconds. I just changed that to 2 minutes. There we go. Chapter 6. If spring came at all to Oak Creek Canyon, it warmed into summer before Carly had time to languish with the fever characteristic of early June in the east. As if by magic, it seemed the green grass sprang up, the green buds opened into leaves, the bluebells and primroses bloomed, the apple and peach blossoms burst exquisitely white and pink against the blue sky. Oak Creek fell to a transparent, beautiful brook, leisurely edifying in the stone-walled nooks, hurrying with murmur and babble over the little falls. The mornings broke clear and fragrantly cool. The noon hours seemed to lag under a hot sun. The nights fell like dark mantles from the melancholy star-sown sky. Carly had stubbornly kept on riding and climbing until she killed her secret doubt that she was really a thoroughbred, until she satisfied her own insistent vanity that she could train to a point where this outdoor life was not too much for her strength. She lost flesh despite increase of appetite. She lost her pallor for a complexion of gold brown she knew her Eastern friends would admire. She wore out the blisters and aches and pains. She found herself growing firmer of muscle, lither of line, deeper of chest. And in addition to these physical manifestations, there were subtle intimations of a delight in a freedom of body she had never before known, of an exhilaration in action that made her hot and made her breathe, of a sloughing off of numberless petty and fussy and luxurious little superficialities which she had supposed were necessary to her happiness. What she had undertaken in vain conquest of Glenn's pride and Flo Hutter's Western tolerance she had found to be a boomerang. She had won Glenn's admiration. She had won the Western girl's recognition. But her passionate, stubborn desire had been ignoble, and was proved so by the rebound of her achievement. Coming home to her with a sweetness she had not the courage to accept. Thank you, Anya. She forced it from her. This West with its rawness, its ruggedness, she hated. Nevertheless, the June days passed, growing dreamily swift, growing more incomprehensibly full, and still she had not broached to Glenn the main object of her visit, to take him back east. Yet a little while longer. She hated his work and had not talked of that. Yet an honest consciousness told her that as time flew by, she feared more and more to tell him that he was wasting his life there, and that she could not bear it. Still, was he wasting it? Once in a while, a timid and unfamiliar Carly Birch voiced a pregnant query. Perhaps what held Carly back most was the happiness she achieved in her walks and rides with Glenn. She lingered because of them. Every day she loved him more, and yet there was something. Was it in her or in him? She had a woman's assurance of his love, and sometimes she caught his breath. So sweet and strong was the tumultuous emotion it stirred. She preferred to enjoy while she could, to dream instead of think. But it was not possible to hold a blank, dreamy, lulled consciousness all the time. Thought would return, and not always could she drive away a feeling that Glenn would never be her slave. She divined something in his mind that kept him gentle and kindly, restrained always, sometimes melancholy and aloof, as if he were an impassive destiny, waiting for the iron consequences he knew inevitably must fall. What was this that he knew, which she did not know? The idea haunted her. Perhaps it was that which compelled her to use all her woman's wiles and charms on Glenn. Still, though it thrilled her to see, she made him love her more as the days passed, she could not blind herself to the truth that no softness or allurement of hers changed this strange restraint in him. How that baffled her! Was it resistance, or knowledge, or nobility, or doubt? Flo Hutter's 20th birthday came along the middle of June, and all the neighbors and range hands for miles around were invited to celebrate it. For the second time during her visit, Carly put on the white gown that had made Flo gasp with delight, and had stunned Mrs. Hutter, and brought a reluctant compliment from Glenn. Carly liked to create a sensation. What were exquisite and expensive gowns for, if not that? It was twilight on this particular June night when she was ready to go downstairs, and she tarried a while on the long porch. The evening star, so lonely and radiant, so cold and passionless in the dusky blue, had become an object she waited for and watched, the same as she had come to love the dreaming, murmuring melody of the waterfall. She lingered there. What had the sights and sounds and smells of this wild canyon come to mean to her? She could not say. But they had changed her immeasurably. Her soft slippers made no sound on the porch, and as she turned the corner of the house, where shadows hovered thick, she heard Lee Stanton's voice. "But, Flo, you loved me before Kilbourne came." The content, the pathos of his voice chained Carly to the spot. Some situations, like fate, were beyond resistance. Oh, no, sorry, that's Lee Stanton. That's Lee Stanton. Sorry, I thought that was the Hayes guy. Okay. "But, Flo, you loved me before Kilbourne came." The content, the pathos of his voice chained Carly to the spot. Some situations, like fate, were beyond resisting. "Sure I did," replied Flo dreamily. This was the voice of a girl who was being confronted by happy and sad thoughts on her birthday. "Don't you love me still?" he asked huskily. "Why, of course, Lee, I don't change," she said. "But then why—" There for the moment his utterance or courage failed. "Lee, do you want the honest-to-God's truth?" I reckon I do." "Well, I love you just as I always did," replied Flo earnestly. "But, Lee, I love him more than you or anybody." "My heaven, Flo, you'll ruin us all!" he exclaimed hoarsely. "No, I won't either. You can't say I'm not level-headed. I hated to tell you this, Lee, but you made me." "Flo, you love me and him, two men?" queried Stanton incredulously. "I sure do," she drawled with a soft laugh, "and it's no fun." "Reckon I don't cut much of a figure alongside Kilbourne," said Stanton disconsolately. "Lee,
You could stand alongside any man," replied Flo eloquently. "You're Western, and you're steady and loyal, and well, someday you'll be like Dad. Can I say more? But, Lee, this man is different." He's wonderful. I can't explain it, but I feel it. He's been through hell's fire. Oh, will I ever forget his ravings when he lay so ill? He means more to me than just one man. He's American. You're American too, Lee, and you trained to be a soldier, and you would have made a grand one, if I know old Arizona, but you were not called to France. Glenn Kilbourne went. God only knows what that means, but he went, and there's the difference. I saw the wreck of him. I did a little to save his life and his mind. I wouldn't be an American girl if I didn't love him. Oh, Lee, can't you understand?" "I reckon so. I'm not begrudging Glenn what you care. I'm only afraid I'll lose you." "I never promised to marry you, did I?" Not in words, but kisses ought to—" "Yes, kisses mean a lot," she replied, "and so far I stand committed. I suppose I'll marry you some day and be blamed lucky. I'll be happy, too. Don't you overlook that hunch. You needn't worry. Glenn is in love with Carly. She's beautiful, rich, and of his class. How could he ever see me?" "Flo, you never can tell," replied Stanton thoughtfully. "I didn't like her at first, but I'm coming round. The thing is, Flo, does she love him as you love him?" "Oh, I think so. I hope so," answered Flo, as if in distress. "I'm not so sure. But then I can't savvy her. Lord knows I hope so, too. If she doesn't, if she goes back east and leaves him here, I reckon my case—" "Hush. I know she's out here to take him back. Let's go downstairs now." "Oh, wait, Flo," he begged. "What's your hurry? Come give me—" "There, that's all you'll get, birthday or no birthday," replied Flo gaily. Carly heard the soft kiss and Stanton's deep breath, and then footsteps as they walked away in the gloom toward the stairway. Carly leaned against the log wall. She felt the rough wood, smelled the rusty pine rosin. Her other hand pressed her bosom, where her heart beat with unwonted vigor. Footsteps and voices sounded beneath her. Twilight had deepened into night. The low murmur of the waterfall and the babble of the brook floated to her strained ears. Listeners never heard good of themselves. But Stanton's subtle doubt of any depth to her, though it hurt, was not so conflicting as the ringing truth of Flo Hutter's love for Glenn. This unsought knowledge powerfully affected Carly. She saw she was forewarned and forearmed now. It saddened her, yet did not lessen her confidence in her hold on Glenn. But it stirred to perplexing pitch her curiosity in regard to the mystery that seemed to cling round Glenn's transformation of character. This Western girl rarely knew more about Glenn than his fiancée knew. Carly suffered a humiliating shock when she realized that she had been thinking of herself, of her love, her life, her needs, her wants, instead of Glenn's. It took no keen intelligence or insight into human nature to see that Glenn needed her more than she needed him. Thus, unwontedly stirred and upset and flung back upon pride of herself, Carly went downstairs to meet the assembled company. And never had she shown to greater contrast, never had circumstance and state of mind contrived to make her so radiant and gay and unbending. She heard many remarks not intended for her far-reaching ears. An old grizzled Westerner remarked to Hutter, "Well, she's sure an unbroke filly." Another of the company, a woman, remarked, "Sweet and pretty as a columbine, but I'd like her better if she was dressed decent." And a gaunt range rider, who stood with others at the porch door, looking on, asked a comrade, "Do you reckon that style is back east?" To which the other replied, "Mebbe,
but I'd gamble they're short on silk back east, and likewise sheriffs." Carly received some meed of gratification out of the sensation she created, but she did not carry her craving for it to the point of overshadowing Flo. On the contrary, she contrived to have Flo share the attention she received. She taught Flo to dance the foxtrot, and got Glenn to dance with her. Then she taught it to Lee Stanton, and when Lee danced with Flo, to the infinite wonder and delight of the onlookers, Carly experienced her first sincere enjoyment of the evening. Her moment came when she danced with Glenn. It reminded her of days long past, and which she wanted to return again. Despite war tramping and western labors, Glenn retained something of his old grace and lightness. But just to dance with him was enough to swell her heart, and for once she grew oblivious to the spectators. "Glenn, would you like to go to the plaza with me again, and dance between dinner courses, as we used to?" she whispered up to him. "Sure I would, unless Morrison knew you were to be there," he replied. "Glenn, I wouldn't even see him." "Any old time you wouldn't see Morrison," he exclaimed half-mockingly. "Who's Morrison? They mentioned Morrison? I don't recall that name. All right." His doubt, his tone, grated upon her. Pressing close to him, she said, "Come back and I'll prove it." But he laughed, and he had no answer. At her own daring words, Carly's heart had leaped to her lips. If he had responded, even teasingly, she could have burst out with her longing to take him back. But silence inhibited her, and the moment passed. At the end of that dance, Hutter claimed Glenn in the interest of neighboring sheepmen. And Carly, crossing the big living room alone, passed close to one of the porch doors. Someone, indistinct in the shadow, spoke to her in a low voice. "Hello, pretty eyes." Carly felt a little cold shock go tingling through her, but she gave no sign that she had heard. She recognized the voice and also the epithet. Passing to the other side of the room and joining the company there, Carly presently took a casual glance at the door. Several men were lounging there. One of them was the sheep-dipper, Hayes Ruff. His bold eyes were on her now, and his coarse face wore a slight, meaning smile, as if he understood something about her that was a secret to others. Carly dropped her eyes. But she could not shake off the feeling that wherever she moved, this man's gaze followed her. The unpleasantness of this incident would have been nothing to Carly had she at once forgotten it. Most unaccountably, however, she could not make herself unaware of this ruffian's attention. It did no good for her to argue that she was merely the cynosure of all eyes. This Ruff's tone and look possessed something heretofore unknown to Carly. Once she was tempted to tell Glenn, but that would only cause a fight, so she kept her own counsel. She danced again and helped Flo entertain her guests, and passed that door often, and once stood before it deliberately with all the strange and contrary impulse so inscrutable in a woman, and never for a moment wholly lost the sense of the man's boldness. It dawned upon her at length that the singular thing about this boldness was its difference from any which had ever been affronted her before. The full smile meant that he thought she saw his attention, and understanding it perfectly, had secret delight in it. Many and various had been the masculine egotisms which had come under her observation, but quite beyond Carly was this brawny sheep-dipper, Hayes Ruff. Once the party broke up and the guests had departed, she instantly forgot both man and incident. Next day, late in the afternoon, when Carly came out on the porch, she was hailed by Flo, who had just ridden in from down the canyon. "Hey, Carly, come down. I sure have something to tell you," she called. Carly did not use any time pattering down that rude porch stairway. Flo was dusty and hot, and her chaps carried the unmistakable scent of sheep dip.
"Been over to Ryan's camp and sure rode hard to beat Glenn home," drawled Flo.
"Why?" queried Carly eagerly.
"Reckon I wanted to tell you something Glenn swore he wouldn't let me tell. He makes me tired. He thinks you can't stand things."
"Oh, has he been hurt?"
"He's skinned and bruised up some, but I reckon he's not hurt."
"Flo, what happened?" demanded Carly anxiously.
"Carly, did you know Glenn can fight like the devil?" asked Flo.
"No, I don't, but I remember he used to be athletic. Flo, you make me nervous. Did Glenn fight?"
"I reckon he did," drawled Flo.
"With whom?"
"Nobody else but that big hombre, Hayes Ruff."
"Oh," gasped Carly with a violent start. That ruffian. Flo, did you see, were you there?"
"I sure was.
"And next to a horse race, I like a fight," replied the Western girl.
"Carly, why didn't you tell me Hayes Ruff insulted you last night?"
"Why, Flo, he only said, 'Hello, pretty eyes,' and I let it pass," said Carly lamely.
"You never want to let anything pass, out west, because next time you get worse. This turns your other cheek. Don't go in Arizona." "But we sure thought Ruff said worse than that, though from him that's a plenty."
"How did you know?"
"Well, Charlie told it. He was standing out here by the door last night, and he heard Ruff speak to you. Charlie thinks a heap of you, and I reckon he hates Ruff. Besides, Charlie stretches things. He sure riled up Glenn, and I want to say, my dear, you missed the best thing that's happened since you got here."
"Hurry, please tell me," begged Carly, feeling the blood come to her face.
"Well, I rode over to Ryan's place for Dad, and when I got there I knew nothing about what Ruff said to you," began Flo, and she took hold of Carly's hand. "Neither did Dad. You see, Glenn hadn't got there yet. Well, just as the men had finished dipping a bunch of sheep, Glenn came riding down lickety-cut. "'Now, what the hell's wrong with Glenn?' said Dad, getting up from where we sat. Sure, I knew Glenn was mad, though I never before saw him that way. He looked sort of grim and black. Well, he rode right down on us and piled off. Dad yelled at him, and so did I, but Glenn made for the sheep pen. You know where we watched Hayes, Ruff, and Lorenzo slinging the sheep into the dip? Ruff was just about to climb out over the fence when Glenn leaped up on it. 'Say, Ruff,' he said, sort of hard, 'Charlie and Ben tell me they heard you speak disrespectfully to Miss Birch last night.' Dad and I ran to the fence, but before we could catch hold of Glenn, he'd jumped down into the pen." "I'm not caring much for what them herders say," replied Ruff. "Do you deny it?" demanded Glenn. "I ain't denying nothing, Kilbourne," growled Ruff. "I might argue against me being disrespectful. That's a matter of opinion. Well, you'll apologize for speaking to Miss Birch, or I'll beat you up and have her to fire you." "Well, Kilbourne, I never eat my words," replied Ruff. Then Glenn knocked him flat. You ought to heard that crack. Sounded like Charlie hitting a steer with a club. Dad yelled, "Look out, Glenn, he packs a gun." Ruff got up mad clear, though, I reckon. Then they mixed it up. Ruff got in some swings, but he couldn't reach Glenn's face, and Glenn battered him right and left, every time in his ugly mug. Ruff got all bloody, and he cussed something awful. Glenn beat him against the fence, and then we all saw Ruff reach for a gun or a knife. All the men yelled, and sure I screamed, but Glenn saw as much as we saw. He got fiercer. He beat Ruff down to his knees and swung on him hard. Deliberately knocked Ruff into the dip ditch. What a splash! It wet all of us. Ruff went out of sight. Then he rolled up like a huge hog. We were all scared now. That dip's rank poison, you know. Reckon Ruff knew that. He floundered along and crawled up at the end. Anyone could see that he had his mouth and eyes tight shut. He began to grope and feel around, trying to find the way to the pond.
one of the men led him out. It was great to see him wade in the water and wallow and souse his head under. When he came out, the men got in front of him and stopped him. He sure looked bad, and Glenn called to him, "Rough, that sheep dip won't go through your tough hide, but a bullet will." Not long after this incident, Carly began... Okay, that's the end. Okay, boy, that was the end of that recounting. Wow. Okay. All right. So okay. Note to self: don't tell ladies they have pretty eyes. Not long after this incident, Carly started out on her usual afternoon ride, having arranged with Glenn to meet her on his return from work. Toward the end of June, Carly had advanced in her horsemanship to a point where Flo lent her one of her own mustangs. This change might not have had all to do with a wonderful difference in riding, but it seemed so to Carly. There was as much difference in horses as in people. This mustang she had ridden of late was of Navajo stock, but he had been born and raised and broken at Oak Creek. Carly had not yet discovered any objection on his part to do as she wanted him to do. He liked what she liked, and most of all he liked to go. His color resembled the pattern of calico, and in accordance with Western ways his name was, therefore, Calico. Left to choose his own gait, Calico always dropped into a gentle pace which was so easy and comfortable and swinging that Carly never tired of it. Moreover, he did not shy at things lying in the road, or rabbits darting from bushes, or at the upwhirring of birds. Carly had grown attached to Calico before she realized she was drifting into it, and for Carly to care for anything or anybody was a serious matter, because it did not happen often, and it lasted. She was exceedingly tenacious of affection. June had almost passed, and summer lay upon the lonely land. Such perfect and wonderful weather had never before been Carly's experience. The dawns broke, cool, fresh, fragrant, sweet and rosy, with a breeze that seemed of heaven rather than earth, and the air seemed tremulously full of the murmur of falling water and the melody of mocking birds. At the solemn noontides the great white sun glared down hot, so hot that it burned the skin, yet strangely was a pleasant burn. The waning afternoons were Carly's especial torment, when it seemed the sounds and winds of the day were tiring, and all things were seeking repose, and life must soften to an unthinking happiness. These hours troubled Carly, because she wanted them to last, and because she knew for her this changing and transforming time could not last. So long as she did not think, she was satisfied. Maples and sycamores and oaks were in full foliage, and their bright greens contrasted softly with the dark shine of the pines. Through the spaces between brown tree trunks and the white-spotted holes of the sycamores gleamed the amber water of the creek. Always there was murmur of little rills and the musical dash of little rapids. On the surface of still, shady pools, trout broke to make ever-widening ripples. Indian paintbrush, so brightly carmine in color, lent touch of fire to the green banks. And under the oaks, in cool dark nooks, where mossy boulders lined the stream, there were stately, nodding, yellow columbines. And high on the rock ledges shot up the wonderful mezcal stalks, beginning to blossom, some with tints of gold and others with tones of red. Riding along down the canyon, under its looming walls, Carly wondered that if, unawares to her, these physical aspects of Arizona could have become more significant than she realized. The thought had confronted her before. Here, as always, she fought it and denied it by the simple defense of elimination. Yet refusing to think of a thing when it seemed ever present was not going to do forever. Insensibly and subtly it might get a hold on her, never to be broken. Yet it was infinitely easier to dream than to think. But the thought encroached upon her that it was not a dreamful habit of mind she had fallen into of late. When she dreamed or mused, she lived vaguely and sweetly over the past happy hours, or dwelt in enchanted fancy upon a possible future. Carly had been told by a Columbia professor that she was a type of the present age, a modern young woman of materialistic mind. Be that as it might, she knew many things seemed loosening from the narrowness and tightness of her character, sloughing away like scales, exposing a new and strange and susceptible softness of fibre. And this blank habit of mind, when she did not think, and now realized that she was not dreaming, seemed to be the body of Carly Birch, and her heart and soul stripped of a shell. Nerve and emotion and spirit received something from her surroundings. She absorbed her environment. She felt. It was a delightful state. But when her own consciousness caused it to elude her, then she both resented and regretted. Anything that approached permanent attachment to this crude and untenanted West, Carly would not tolerate for a moment. Reluctantly, she admitted it had bettered her health, quickened her blood, and quite relegated Florida and the Adirondacks to little consideration. "Well, as I told Glenn," soliloquized Carly, "every time I'm almost won over a little to Arizona, she gives me a hard jolt. I'm getting near being mushy today. Now let's see what I'll get. I suppose that's my pessimism or materialism. Funny how Glenn keeps saying it's the jolts, the hard knocks, the fights that are best remembered afterward. I don't get that at all." 5 miles below West Fork, a road branched off and climbed the left side of the canyon. It was a rather steep road, long and zigzagging and full of rocks and ruts. Carly did not enjoy ascending it, but she preferred the going up to coming down. It took half an hour to climb. Once up on the flat cedar-dotted desert, she was met full in the face by a hot, dusty wind coming from the south. Carly searched her pockets for her goggles, only to ascertain that she had forgotten them. Nothing except a freezing, sleety wind annoyed and punished Carly so much as a... what? Nothing except a freezing, sleety wind annoyed and punished Carly so much as a hard, puffy wind, full of sand and dust. Somewhere along the first few miles of this road she was to meet Glenn. If she turned back for any cause, he would be worried, and, what concerned her more vitally, he would think she had not the courage to face a little dust. So Carly rode on. The wind appeared to be gusty. It would blow hard a while, then lull for a few moments. On the whole, however, it increased in volume and persistence until she was riding against a gale. She had now come to a bare, flat, gravelly region, scant of cedars and brush, and far ahead she could see a dull yellow pall rising high into the sky. It was a dust storm, and it was sweeping down on the wings of that gale. Carly remembered that somewhere along this flat there was a log cabin which had before provided shelter for her and Flo when they were caught in a rainstorm. It seemed unlikely that she had passed by this cabin. Resolutely she faced the gale and knew she had a task to find that refuge. If there had been a big rock or bushy cedar to offer shelter, she would have welcomed it. But there was nothing. When the hard, dusty gusts hit her, she found it absolutely necessary to shut her eyes. At intervals less windy, she opened them and rode on, peering through the yellow gloom for the cabin. Thus she got her eyes full of dust, an alkali dust that made them sting and smart. The fiercer puffs of wind carried pebbles large enough to hurt severely. Then the dust clogged her nose, and sand got between her teeth. Added to these annoyances was a heat like a blast from a furnace. Carly perspired freely, and that caked the dust on her face. She rode on, gradually growing more uncomfortable and miserable. Yet even then she did not utterly lose a sort of thrilling zest in being thrown upon her own responsibility. She could hate an obstacle, yet feel something of pride in holding her own against it. Another mile of buffeting, this increasing gale, so exhausted Carly and wrought upon her nerves that she became nearly panic-stricken. It grew harder and harder not to turn back. At last she was about to give up when, right at hand, through the flying dust, she espied the cabin. "Oh, we've got someone from Kazakhstan. What's up?" "What is up?" "Hello there." "How you doing there?" Riding behind it, she dismounted and tied the Mustang to a post. Then she ran around to the door and entered. What a welcome refuge! She was all right now, and when Glenn came along she would have added to her already considerable list another feat for which he would commend her. With aid of her handkerchief and the tears that flowed so copiously, Carly presently freed her eyes of the blinding dust. But when she essayed to remove it from her face, she discovered she would need a towel and soap and hot water. The cabin appeared to be enveloped in a soft, swishing, hollow sound. It seeped and rustled. Then the sound lulled, only to rise again. Carly went to the door, relieved, and glad to see that the dust storm was blowing by. The great, sky-high pall of yellow had moved on to the north. Puffs of dust were whipping along the road, but no longer in one continuous cloud. In the west, low down, the sun was sinking, a dull magenta in hue, quite weird and remarkable. "I knew I'd get the jolt all right," soliloquized Carly warily, as she walked to a rude couch of poles and sat down upon it. She had begun to cool off, and there, feeling dirty and tired and slowly wearing to the old depression, she composed herself to wait. Suddenly she heard the clip-clop of hoofs. "There, that's Glenn," she cried, gladly, and rising, and running to the door. She saw a big bay horse bearing a burly rider. He discovered her at the same instant and pulled his horse. "Ho, ho, if it ain't Pretty Eyes," he called out in a gay, coarse voice. Carly recognized the voice, and then the epithet. Before her sight established the man as Hayes Ruff. A singular, stultifying shock passed over her. "Well, by all that's lucky," he said, dismounting. "I knowed we'd meet some day. I can't say I just laid for you, but I kept my eyes open." Manifestly he knew she was alone, for he did not glance into the cabin. "I'm waiting for Glenn," she said, with lips she tried to make stiff. "Sure, I reckoned that," he replied genially. "But he won't be along yet a while." He spoke with a cheerful inflection of tone, as if the fact designated was one that would please her, and his swarthy, seamy face expanded into a good-humored, meaning smile. Then, without any particular rudeness, he pushed her back from the door into the cabin and stepped across the threshold. "How dare you!" cried Carly. A hot anger that stirred in her seemed to be beaten down and smothered by a cold, shaking, internal commotion, threatening collapse. This man loomed over her, huge, somehow monstrous in his brawny, uncouth presence, and his knowing smile and the hard, glinting twinkle of his light eyes, devilishly intelligent and keen, in no wise lessened the sheer, brutal force of him physically. Sight of his bulk was enough to terrorize Carly. "Me? Oh, I'm a daring hombre and a devil with the women," he said with a guffaw. Carly could not collect her wits. The instant of his pushing her back into the cabin and following her had shocked her and almost paralyzed her will. If she saw him now, any the less fearful, she could not so quickly rally her reason to any advantage. "Let me out of here," she demanded. "Nope, I'm a-goin' make a little love to you," he said, and he reached for her with great, hairy hands. Carly saw in them the strength that had so easily swung the sheep. She saw, too, that they were dirty, greasy hands, and they made her flesh creep.
"Glenn will kill you," she panted.
"What for?" he queried, in real or pretended surprise. "Oh, I know women. You'll never tell 'em."
"Yes, I will."
"Well, maybe. I reckon you're lying, Pretty Eyes," he replied with a grin. "Anyhow, I'll take a chance."
"I tell you, he'll kill you,"
repeated Carly, backing away until her weak knees came against the couch. "What for, I ask you?" he demanded.
"For this insult."
"Huh. I'd like to know who's insulted you. Can't a man take an invitation to kiss and hug a girl without insulting her?"
"Invitation? Are you crazy?" queried Carly, bewildered.
"Nope, I'm not crazy, and I sure said invitation. I meant that white shimmy dress you wore the night of Flo's party. That's my invitation to get a little fresh with your Pretty Eyes." Yes, the old, well, she was wearing something. Carly could only stare at him. His words seemed to have some peculiar, unanswerable power. "Well, if it wasn't an invitation, what was it?" he asked, with another step that brought him within reach of her. He waited for her answer, which was not forthcoming. "Well, you're getting kind of pale around the gills," he went on derisively. "I reckoned you was a real sport. Come here." He fastened one of his great hands in front of her coat and gave a pull. So powerful was it that Carly came hard against him, almost knocking her breathless. Then he held her a moment and then put his other arm round her. It seemed to crush both breath and sense out of her. Suddenly limp, she sank strengthless. She seemed reeling in darkness. Then she felt herself thrust away from him with violence. She sank on the couch, and her head and shoulders struck the wall. "Say, if you're going to keel over like that, I pass," declared Ruff in disgust. "Can't you Eastern women stand nothing?" Carly's eyes opened and beheld this man in an attitude of supremely derisive protest. "You look like a sick kitten," he added. "When I get me a sweetheart or wife, I want her to be a wildcat." His scorn and repudiation of her gave Carly intense relief. She sat up and endeavored to collect her shattered nerves. Ruff gazed down at her with great disapproval and even disappointment. "Say, did you have some fool idea I was going to kill you?" he queried gruffly.
"I'm afraid I did," faltered Carly.
Her relief was a release. It was so strange that it was gratefulness. "Well, I reckon I wouldn't have hurt you. None of these flop-over Janes for me. And I'll give you a hunch, Pretty Eyes. You might have run across a fella that was no gentleman." Of all the amazing statements that had ever been made to Carly, this one seemed the most remarkable. "What'd you wear that unnatural white dress for?" he demanded, as if he had a right to be her judge.
"Unnatural?"
echoed Carly. "Sure, that's what I said. Any woman's dress without top or bottom is unnatural. It's not right. Why, you looked like... Here he floundered for adequate expression. "Like one of the devil's angels. And I want to hear why you wore it."
"For the same reason I'd wear any dress," she felt forced to reply.
"Pretty Eyes, that's a lie. And you know it's a lie. You wore that white dress to knock the daylights out of men. Only you ain't honest enough to say so. Even me or my kind. Even us who are dirt under your little feet. But all the same, we're men. And maybe better men than you'd think. If you had to put that dress on, why didn't you stay in your room? No, you had to come down and strut around and show off your beauty. And I ask you, if you're a nice girl like Flo Hutter, what'd you wear it for?" Carly was not only mute, she felt rise and burn in her a singular shame and surprise. "I'm only a sheep-dipper," went on Ruff, "but I ain't no fool. A fella doesn't have to live east and wear swell clothes to have sense. Maybe you'll learn that the West is bigger'n you think. A man's a man, east or west, but if your eastern men stand for such dresses as that white one, they'd do well to come out west a while, like your lover, Glenn Kilbourne. I've been rustling round here 10 years, and I've never before seen a dress like yours, and I never heard of a girl being insulted either. Maybe you think I insulted you. Well, I didn't, for I reckon nothing could insult you in that dress. And my last hunch is this, Pretty Eyes, you're not what a hombre like me calls either square or game. Adios. This is so ridiculous. His bulky figure darkened the doorway, passed out, and the light of the sky streamed into the cabin again. Carly sat staring. She heard rough spurs tinkle, then the ring of steel on stirrup, a sodden, leathery sound as he mounted, and after that a rapid pound of hoofs, quickly dying away. He was gone. She had escaped something raw and violent. Dazedly she realized it with unutterable relief, and she sat there, slowly gathering the nervous force that had been shattered. Every word that he had uttered was stamped into startling characters upon her consciousness. But she was still under the deadening influence of shock. This raw experience was the worst the West had yet dealt her. It brought back former states of revulsion and formed them in one whole, irrefutable and damning judgment that seemed to blot out the vaguely dawning and growing happy susceptibilities. It was, perhaps, just as well to have her mind reverted to realistic fact. The presence of Hayes Ruff, the astounding truth of the contact with the huge, sheep-defiled hands, had been profanation and degradation, under which she sickened with fear and shame. Yet hovering back of her shame and rising anger seemed to be a pale, monstrous, and indefinable thought, insistent and accusing, with which she must sooner or later reckon. It might have been the voice of the new side of her nature, but at that moment of outraged womanhood and of revolt against the West, she would not listen. It might, too, have been the still small voice of conscience. But decision of mind and energy coming to her then, she threw off the burden of emotion and perplexity, and forced herself into composure before the arrival of Glenn. The dust had ceased to blow, although the wind had by no means died away. Sunset marked the west in an old rose and gold, a vast flare. Carly espied a horseman far down the road, and presently recognized both rider and steed. He was coming fast. She went out, and mounting her Mustang, she rode out to meet Glenn. It did not appeal to her to wait for him at the cabin. Besides, hoof tracks other than those made by her Mustang might have been noticed by Glenn. Presently he came up to her and pulled his loping horse. "Hello, I sure was worried," was his greeting as his gloved hand went out to her. "Did you run into that sandstorm?" "It ran into me, Glenn, and buried me," she laughed. His fine eyes lingered on her face with glad and warm glance, and the keen, apprehensive penetration of a lover. "Well, under all that dust, you look scared," he said. "Scared? I was worse than that. When I first ran into the flying dirt, I was only afraid I'd lose my way, and my complexion. But when the worst of the storm hit me, then I feared I'd lose my breath." "Did you face that sand and ride through it all?" he queried. "No, not all, but enough. I went through the worst of it before I reached the cabin," she replied. "Wasn't it great?" "Yes, great bother and annoyance," she said laconically. Whereupon he reached with long arm... Why is a comma there? Okay. Whereupon he reached with long arm and wrapped it around her as they rocked side by side. Demonstrations of this nature were infrequent with Glenn. Despite losing one foot out of a stirrup and her seat in the saddle, Carly rather encouraged it. He kissed her dusty face, and then set her back. "By George, Carly, sometimes I think you've changed since you've been here," he said with warmth. "To go through that sandstorm without one kick, one knock at my west."
"Glenn, I always think of what Flo says, the worst is yet to come," replied Carly, trying to hide her unreasonable and tumultuous pleasure at words of praise from him.
"Carly Birch, you don't know yourself," he declared enigmatically.
"What woman knows herself? But do you know me?"
"Not I. Yet sometimes I see depths in you, wonderful possibilities, submerged under your poise, under your fixed, complacent, idle attitude toward life." This seemed for Carly to be dangerously skating near thin ice, but she could not resist a retort.
"Depths in me? Why, I'm a shallow, transparent stream like your West Fork. And as for possibilities, may I ask of them what you imagined you see?"
"As a girl, before you were claimed by the world, you were earnest at heart. You had big hopes and dreams, and you had intellect, too. But you have wasted your talents, Carly. Having money and spending and living for pleasure, you have not realized your powers. Now, don't look hurt. I'm not censuring you. It's just the way of modern life, and most of your friends have been more careless, thoughtless, useless than you. All right, you have a great day there, Anya. Have a great day." The aim of their existence... this is... who's talking? This is Kilbourne again. "Most of your friends have been more careless, thoughtless, and useless than you. The aim of their existence is to be comfortable, free from work, worry, pain. They want pleasure, luxury. And what a pity it is. The best of you girls regard marriage as an escape instead of responsibility. You don't marry to get your shoulders square against the old wheel of American progress, to help some man make good, to bring a troop of healthy American kids into the world. You bare your shoulders to the gaze of the multitude and like it best if you are strung with pearls."
"Glenn, you distress me when you talk like this," replied Carly soberly. "You did not used to talk so. It seems you're bitter against women."
"Oh, no, Carly. I'm only sad," he said. "I only see where once I was blind. American women are the finest on earth, but as a race, if they don't change, they're doomed to extinction."
"How can you say such things?" demanded Carly with spirit.
"I say them because they are true. Carly, on the level now, tell me how many of your immediate friends have children?" Put to a test, Carly rapidly went over in mind her circle of friends, with the result that she was somewhat shocked and amazed to realize how few of them were even married, and how the babies of her acquaintance were limited to 3. It was not easy to admit this to Glenn. "My dear," replied he, "if that does not show you the handwriting on the wall, nothing ever will."
"A girl has to find a husband, doesn't she?" asked Carly, roused to the defense of her sex. And if she's anybody, she has to find one in her set. Well, husbands are not plentiful. Marriage certainly is not the end of existence these days. We have to get along somehow. The high cost of living is no inconsiderable factor today. Do you know that most of the better-class apartment houses in New York will not take children? Women are not all to blame. Take the speed mania. Men must have automobiles. I know one girl who wanted a baby, but her husband wanted a car. They couldn't afford both."
"Carly, I'm not blaming women more than men," returned Glenn. "I don't know that I blame them as a class, but in my own mind I've worked it all out. Every man or woman who is genuinely American should read the signs of the times, realize the crisis, and meet it in an American way. Otherwise, we're done as a race. Money is God in the older countries, but it should never become God in America. If it does, we will make the fall of Rome pale into insignificance."
"Glenn, let's put off the argument," appealed Carly. "I'm not just up to fighting you today. Oh, you needn't smile. I'm not showing a yellow streak, as Flo puts it. I'll fight you some other time."
"You're right, Carly. he assented. "Here we are, loafing 6 or 7 miles from home. Let's rustle along." Riding fast with Glenn was something Carly had only of late achieved in her achievements. She had greatest pride in it, so she urged her mustang to keep pace with Glenn's horse, and gave herself up to the thrill of the motion and feel of the wind and sense of flying along. At a good swinging lope, Calico covered ground swiftly and did not tire. Carly rode the 2 miles to the rim of the canyon, keeping alongside of Glenn all the way. Indeed, for one long level stretch she and Glenn held hands. When they arrived at the descent, which necessitated slow and careful riding, she was hot and tingling and breathless, worked by the action into an exuberance of pleasure. Glenn complimented her riding as well as her rosy cheeks. There was indeed a sweetness in working at a task, as she had worked to learn to ride in Western fashion. Every turn of her mind seemed to confront her with sobering antithesis of thought. Why had she come to love to ride down a lonely desert road, through ragged cedars, where the wind whipped her face with fragrant wild breath, if at the same time she hated the West? Could she hate a country, however barren and rough, if it had saved the health and happiness of her future husband? Verily, there were problems for Carly to solve. Early twilight purple lay low in the hollows and clefts of the canyon. Over the western rim a pale ghost of the evening star seemed to smile at Carly, to bid her look and look. Like a strain of distant music, the dreamy hum of falling water, the murmur and melody of the stream, came again to Carly's sensitive ear. "Do you love this?" asked Glenn, when they reached the green-forested canyon floor, with the yellow road winding away into the purple shadows. "Yes, both the ride and you," flashed Carly contrarily. She knew he had meant the deep-walled canyon, with its brooding solitude. "But I want you to love Arizona," he said. "Glenn, I'm a faithful creature. You should be glad of that. I love New York." "Very well, then, Arizona to New York," he said, lightly brushing her cheeks with his lips. And swerving back into his saddle, he spurred his horse and called back over his shoulder, "That mustang and Flo have beaten me many a time. Come on." It was not so much his words as his tone and look that roused Carly. Had he resented her loyalty to the city of her nativity? Always there was a little rift in the lute. Had his tone and look meant that Flo might catch him, if Carly could not? Absurd as the idea was, it spurred her to recklessness. Her mustang did not need any more. Her mustang did not need any more than to know she wanted him to run. The road was of soft yellow earth, flanked with green foliage and overspread by pines. In a moment she was racing at a speed she had never before half attained on a horse. Down the winding road Glenn's big steed sped, his head low, his stride tremendous, his action beautiful. But Carly saw the distance between them diminishing. Calico was overtaking the bay. She cried out in the thrilling excitement of the moment. Glenn saw her gaining and pressed his mount to greater speed. Still he could not draw away from Calico. Slowly the little mustang gained. It seemed to Carly that riding him required no effort at all, and at such a fast pace, with the wind roaring in her ears, the walls of green vague and continuous in her sight, the sting of pine tips on cheeks and neck, the yellow road streaming toward her. Under her there rose out of the depths of her, out of the tumult of her breast, a sense of glorious exultation. She closed in on Glenn from the She closed in on Glenn. From the flying hoofs of his horse shot up showers of damp sand and gravel that covered Carly's riding habit and spattered in her face. She had to hold up a hand before her eyes. Perhaps this caused her to lose something of her confidence or her swing in the saddle, for suddenly she realized she was not riding well. The pace was too fast for her inexperience, but nothing could have stopped her then. No fear or awkwardness of hers should be allowed to hamper that thoroughbred mustang. Carly felt that Calico understood the situation, or at least he knew he could catch and pass this big bay horse, and he intended to do it. Carly was hard put to it to hang on and keep the flying sand from blinding her. When Calico drew alongside the bay horse and brought Carly breast to breast with Glenn, and then inch by inch forged ahead of him, Carly pealed out an exultant cry. Either it frightened Calico or inspired him, for he shot right ahead of Glenn's horse. Then he lost the smooth, wonderful action. He seemed hurtling through space at the expense of tremendous muscular action. Carly could feel it. She lost her equilibrium. She seemed rushing through a blurred green and black aisle of the forest with a gale in her face. Then, with a sharp jolt, a break, Calico plunged to the sand. Carly felt herself propelled forward out of the saddle into the air and down to strike with a sliding, stunning force that ended in sudden, dark oblivion. Upon recovering consciousness, she first felt a sensation of oppression in her chest and a dull numbness of her whole body. When she opened her eyes, she saw Glenn bending over her, holding her head on his knee. A wet, cold, reviving sensation, evidently, came from the handkerchief with which he was mopping her face. "Carly, you can't be hurt, really," he was exclaiming, in eager hope. "There was some spill, but you lit on the sand and slid. You can't be hurt." The look of his eyes, the tone of his voice, the feel of his hands were such that Carly chose for a moment to pretend to be very badly hurt indeed. It was worth taking a header to get so much from Glenn Kilbourne. But she believed she had suffered no more than a severe bruising and scraping. "Glenn, dear," she whispered, very low and very eloquently, "I think my back is broken. You'll be free soon." Glenn gave a terrible start, and his face turned a deadly white. He burst out with quavering, inarticulate speech. Carly gazed up at him and then closed her eyes. She could not look at him while carrying on such deceit. Yet the sight of him and the feel of him then were inexpressibly blissful to her. What she needed most was assurance of his love. She had it. Beyond doubt, beyond morbid fancy, the truth had proclaimed itself, filling her heart with joy. Suddenly, she flung her arms up around his neck. "Oh, Glenn, it was too good a chance to miss. I'm not hurt a bit." Man, all these, okay, I guess that's a payback for that practical joke Glenn played on her yesterday, where he like threw a sheepskin on himself and pretended to be a wolf leaping out at her. To tell you what, there was some muddled up, problematic stuff in that chapter. Good Lord. Unreal.